So I should probably start by letting you guys know that my dissertation was actually on Aeschylus, and so that's why I do all of this. It's still something I go back to. But over the years, first through working with Aeschylus' Persians, and then Herodotus and other texts, I've sort of expanded myself, and I've become mostly interested currently in the issues around identity environment. And that's actually one of the places where a lot of my talk is going to be focused this evening, as we look at certain theories from antiquity, particularly environmental determinism theory, and theories of purity and descent that come from our ancient texts and make their way into the modern world through scientific racism. So first off, are there any population geneticists in the darn, I was hoping. Oh, excellent. I've sort of made some cursory summary summations of what of the Human Genome Project and other things that we can maybe get some support for explanation after the fact if people have more questions, because I won't be able to answer them. My work with genetics is mostly through archaeology and ancient DNA material, so it's a little bit different. So ancient conceptions of race and ethnicity were much studied in the classical education that was standard in 19th and 20th century America. Today I want to explore the myriad ways that such ideas were resurrected and manipulated as a science of man that could be used and continue to be used today to justify slavery, eugenics, and white supremacism. So I'll start with a brief sort of overview, very brief overview of race science, what we mean when we use that term, and then look at the ancient theories. So race science is really a set of disciplines or fields that aim at understanding the biological causes of human variation in order to, this is the important part, in order to classify and rank humans against each other. So once you looking at human variation is one thing. Once you start looking at it to try to find out who the inferior and superior people are, you've entered into the world of race science instead of simply science. In race science, there is a presumption that there is a superior group that all other groups are inferior to, and that it is a matter of a quote-unquote survival of the fittest, though this phrase will not actually enter into the discourse of race science until after 1859 with Darwin's Origin of the Species. Eugenics, which I want to start with, is actually one of the primary branches of what we call race science or scientific racism. So the Galton Laboratories of National Eugenics was founded at first as the Eugenics Records Office in 1904 in University College London by Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, who believed firmly not only that his cousin's theory of evolution and natural selection was correct, but that it could be applied to humans and accelerated through intentional and careful breeding programs. Francis Galton coined the term eugenics, combining the Greek eu, meaning well, and genos, meaning born, to form the term well-born. This is not an ancient term, though it is in fact not outside of the tradition that the ancients would use, thinking of something like eupatridae, which is a group within Athens of aristocrats and other places. It's an ancient naming practice, if not an ancient word itself. The goal of his laboratory was to influence policy and encourage the government to create programs that forced sterilizations and birth control for the lower classes and non-whites. And one of his biggest proponents, who was a member of the National Eugenics Society, was Winston Churchill, which many people don't know. After World War II, about 50 to 20 years after World War II, the laboratory was renamed the Department of Genetics, Evolution, and Environment in an attempt to distance itself from the atrocities of the Holocaust. Now, eugenics is not the earliest form of race science. Modern race science's origins can be traced back to Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And I'll give you a picture of, this is his 5 races. He published his material on skulls between 1789 and 1829, I believe. But skulls are going to sort of become the baseline. Craniometry is going to become a baseline for the developing form of race science. Blumenbach adhered to a principle called monogenesis that assumed that all humans were ultimately derived from two, in fact, ancestors. That there was human degeneracy, or human variation, was due to what he called degeneracy, i.e. he assumed that some groups of humans, which he called races, had degenerated from their original form after moving to a new, less well-suited or inferior climate, and also as a result of bad diet. So be careful if you eat Cheetos, what might happen. Right? The original humans, who he assumed were Adam and Eve, were, he believed, white people whom he called Caucasian. So this is the guy who coins the use of the term Caucasian to refer to white people. And he assumed that they all came from somewhere in Asia, which is where he imagined the Garden of Eden to be. And if you haven't read it, there's a really good book called Divine Variations, how Christian theology forms the basis of modern race science by Terence Keel, who is a historian and Black Studies professor at UCLA and a member of the Center for Genetics Research there. He supported this theory through the study of skulls, as you can see. And this idea did not end with Blumenbach, nor was it a fringe idea. Others who contributed to this science, right, include almost a who's who list of 19th century physicians, anthropologists, and biologists. Men like Samuel George Morton, William Flinders Petrie, Otis Mason, who was the first curator of anthropology at the Smithsonian Institute, Francis Galton, of course, and surprisingly, even the young Franz Boas. Perhaps the most well-known and most influential book in U.S. race science was that by Nott and Glidden called The Types of Mankind. This is a couple of images that are fairly well-known from Nott and Glidden's Types of Mankind. On my left, this side, you see, actually it's on the right side of the slide, so whatever, right side of the slide, somewhere. This is a sketch that was done. So part of the impetus for Nott and Glidden's book is Glidden was an Egyptologist, and Glidden looked to some of these recently discovered tomb paintings to see where they could identify the quote-unquote types of men. And so these were considered to be originating races, and through this we're actually going to see a German trend that actually lays claim to Egypt as a Nordic-founded civilization later on. But you have Libyans, Nubians, I can't remember which one's the middle, Asians they're called in the text, Asiatics in the text, and then the Egyptians. All of these different scientists and archaeologists and anthropologists and physicians argued for and assumed a connection between genes, evolution, even if they didn't call it that at the time, and environment. And all of them assumed the natural primacy and superiority of peoples from Northern Europe. So, what are the ancient connections here? Now, this connection between genetics, evolution, and environment shouldn't actually surprise anyone who knows anything about modern genetics and the understanding of the role of environmental impact in the history of evolution. But it is not, in fact, clear to many people how these three things came to be connected in people's minds, why they searched for it in the first place. And the answer is, in fact, because they have always been connected in the history of science, going all the way back to the 5th century BC. And in fact, one could argue that it goes all the way back to Homer with the Cyclops. But the ideas were transmitted in texts that continue to be copied, read, and accepted as authoritative in Europe, West Asia, and North Africa from the 5th century BC until the early 20th century. The ideas within those ancient texts, the Hippocratic Corpus, Aristotle, Plato, Herodotus, Galen, surprisingly a guy named Vitruvius, who many of you probably don't know who that is, these form an undercurrent of assumptions that we actually take for granted now, but we no longer know where they come from. Most important of these ideas for this talk are assumptions that we make about what can and cannot be inherited from our parents and how we assume that environment impacts or does not impact life outcomes. And one thing I'll note, as I started doing this research about 5 or 6 years ago, I've become very conscientious of the fact that whenever I feel cold and I say, oh, I can't deal with cold because I'm from California, that's actually a remnant of these ideas that we sort of have taken as part of our everyday sort of life. We just assume that we acclimatize and things like this. Now, from the ancient texts on the one hand, we have a whole series of texts that promote an idea that we call environmental determinism. The environment, and we mean here climate, topography, geography, and it can, with Vitruvius and others, include built environments as well. It was assumed to have a direct, if not immediate, impact on the physical body at the level of what the ancients called the seed. And here you might think of this as like sort of the ancient version of, sometimes we translate it as sperm, sometimes we translate it as matter, or sort of, it's kind of the stuff that carries the soul from the male into the matter of the female in ancient medical terminology. So the woman provides the matter from which humans are composed, and the man provides the blueprint for it in the thing called the seed, and the seed also carries the soul. with it. So conception is when the soul and the sort of blueprint enter into the matter. And women are produced when there is a problem in the process and a deformed human comes into being. This is according to Aristotle, because I love him so much. So what would happen is that something could happen with the climate that can impact the seed at the moment of conception, depending on where conception takes place and what is contained in the seed. So the idea isn't that if you move from Nubia, or Nubian moved up from Kush to Germany in antiquity, they would not suddenly give birth to a German child because the blueprint has within it the climate of the past. So there has to be multiple, they recognize that you have to have multiple generations before you can actually see any sort of impact of environment. They would say they never came up with a plan for testing this, but of course we know that it takes thousands and thousands of years for any sort of mutation to take place. But they thought it could happen, they just didn't know how it could happen. But the idea is that those who were born in a hot climate with a lot of sun will have black skin because they are literally sunburnt. Whereas those who are born in the far north will have really, they didn't call it white skin, they called it red, because you were considered to be frostburned by the cold. So the severity of the cold makes you have really pale skin and flushed cheeks, right? Like you get if you're outside in the cold. And so these were things that you would carry with you on your body that marked you from the environment. Now, changes in the environment could wreak havoc on the body or change them in different ways. The assumption, however, is that there's an ideal. And that ideal is, of course, according to the Greeks and the Romans themselves, because they lived according to themselves in the ideal climate. You have the far north, which is cold and wet. You have the far south, which is hot and dry. And then you have the perfect balance of all of that in the Mediterranean, which is, of course, true today. Right. This is actually based on humoral theory. And humoral theory is that human beings are combinations of hot and dry, hot and wet, and hot and cold and wet and dry, and that health comes by having a perfect balance of all of those things within you, right? So this is why they would bleed people, or which they would recommend sort of wrapping yourself in cold or wrapping yourself in hot. This idea is that you have to get that balance within you, and that will take care of your health and find you in balance. And we see this in a lot of ancient medical texts, but also texts outside of medical texts, but that are thinking about health through this framework. Now, these ideas have their most explicit explication, though I say explicit but not necessarily clear explication, in the Hippocratic Airs, Waters, Places, Aristotle's History of Animals, and Vitruvius's De Architectura. The last one may be surprising, but theory of architecture in Vitruvius is that all buildings and structures must mirror the proportions of the body. And so there's a lot of discussion in those texts of the body and how the body actually helps us find symmetry and balance, etc. He also spends a lot of time talking about built environments. Even though they didn't know germ theory, they had a really good idea, even back in the Hippocratic text, of how malaria was transferred. They didn't know about the little mosquito things, or germs or anything, but they did know that if you lived near stagnant waters, that you would have a more malarious environment, and this is why they would engineer different locations, and they were very good at siting cities. They knew how to site cities to avoid stagnant water and other problems. So Vitruvius talks about this extensively. Now, all three of these texts, people don't always know, were part of the core curriculum at many of the colleges and universities in the United States from the 1870s to the 1930s. Aristotle's History of Animals was, of course, also very influential on Darwin. In the history of evolutionary theory, the environment still has a place, of course, as we assume that a given climate, topography, or geography has been over thousands of years an impetus sometimes for evolutionary change. The other theory that we have from antiquity, so that theory is in many ways fairly neutral. It doesn't actually, they do say that the climate is perfect in the middle, and the Romans are very chauvinistic about this, but in terms of what we would consider a sort of race-making or race-based structure, this is not the one. But the next one that I'm going to describe to you is in fact potentially a race-making system, a race system in antiquity. So this one is the idea that inheritance, the idea of inheritance and what can and can't be inherited, and in the case of eugenics that we might see, whether this can be controlled. These theories are rooted in ancient ideas that there are certain people who are better than others and that the source of their superiority is inborn. We see this in class structures in the ancient cities, and we also see it in gender structures in the ancient cities, and we will see it in structures dealing with ethnic groups within the ancient city. The most representative of these theories, in fact, is one that is structured around ethnicity and not gender or class, and that is the Athenian myth of autochthony. Autochthony is this idea that the Athenians had, which we sometimes translate as being born. It literally means born from the earth. You're auto-generated from the ground. But it's also the term that we often translate either as indigenous, or it's the term that you would use if you're talking about a group of people who have not migrated to their current location. The Athenians elevate this myth to almost a sort of national identity after the 451 BC. In 451 BC, they passed a law that we refer to as the Periclean Citizenship Law that required, really unusually, from what we know of ancient polis, that both parents in a city had to be citizens in order for the child who was born to be a citizen. Typically, it required the father only in most cities, but in Athens, they changed the law to reflect this. And we see a concurrent rise of the iconography and the use of the theory of autochthony in lots of texts, in tragedies, in funeral orations that were given over the city-state, and elsewhere. And then, of course, it actually is built into the structure of the Acropolis in the building known as the Erechtheum, which contains within it all the various spaces that are structured around and attached to this myth of autochthony of the Athenians. Now, the idea was that autochthony, as the Athenians were so unique, and they were so unique because they were bound to the land that they actually came from, that they then legalized a structure around it that was meant to maintain their exceptionalism in this way. And here's where I say we might have something that resembles a modern race structure. They created an entire legal system around immigrants and free slaves that is meant to keep them out of the body politic. The idea is that you need to protect your exceptionalism by restricting and containing intermarriage and particularly reproduction with non-Athenians. And then you represent those types of children who are born from what we would call mixed marriages of metics or freed slaves and immigrants and freed slaves, and the citizens. They would actually be talked about in terms of contamination. We see this particularly in fictional and tragic representations, this language of contamination. And although he is no lover of the democracy in his Republic, Plato actually lays out one of the clearest explications of the reasoning behind such exceptionalism. And in his Noble Lie, he bases this upon a long-standing myth of metals, which goes back all the way to the 7th century with Hesiod, which suggested that such exceptionalism was itself inborn and could be corrupted. Aristotle's History of Animals, in addition to including the idea of environmental impact, also contains these ideas of proper breeding and of inheritance of inborn qualities. His Politics carries these ideas from the body of animals, amongst which he includes humans, to the body politic. Now, the texts of these authors are the texts that over the course of the 19th and early 20th century, and then again in the Cold War, formed the creation, as part of the creation of the Plato to NATO sort of Western Civ curriculum, that these came to form the backbone, Plato, Aristotle, etc., of what we call the Western canon, and became the core of classics teaching. And here you would include things like Thucydides and the funeral oration, the tragedies of Euripides in particular, but also Aeschylus and Sophocles to a lesser degree. Now, the discipline of classics has in many ways mirrored the developments of modern race science in its own understanding of the ancient world. And it's traditionally compressed the ancient world's varieties of identities, peoples, and cultures in that ancient Mediterranean first by erasing and treating as ancillary, and even inferior, the cultures of Africa and Asia that were intimately a part of and heavily influential on and intertwined with the Greeks and Romans. Then, by compressing the varieties of identities and cultures of those whom we actually call Greeks and Romans. Typically, when you look at a classics curriculum, it teaches stuff from Athens in a very strict time period, and we talk about Rome and perhaps Italy, but how many of you have actually ever taken a course on the provinces of Rome? I'd love to see a show of hands on that. No one ever bites on that one because no one's ever done it. It's always struck me as well how on the literature side we narrow Greece from the broad representation that we see in the so-called archaic authors. They're from all over the Mediterranean world. They're from Ionia, they're from North Africa, they're from all over, to almost exclusively Athenian voices that we call the classical canon. And then we dismiss much of the variety and vibrancy under the name Hellenistic in the later periods. We also forget that these labels, archaic, classical, Hellenistic, are evolutionary, and they're value judgments. Archaic is undeveloped. We tend to pretend that Homer's not part of that. We put Homer in his own period, and then we have the archaic period after him. Classical is the best, and Hellenistic is derivative and only Greek-like. That is, in fact, what Hellenistic means. We then apply these to these time periods, these archaic, classical, Hellenistic, to the history of the Greeks. We pass value judgments on the world they inhabited. The archaic period was a developing world where democracy and the polis were only beginning their formation. The classical was the polis and democracy supposedly in its purest and best form, while the Hellenistic world, the most diverse and most vibrantly mobile, and with the most literary and artistic experimentation, is deemed often inferior and corrupt. As the discipline developed, we focused more and more only on the classical because it was the best. And this in turn shaped who we thought should be able to study classics. Because along with only studying the best things, classics has traditionally been a discipline that also touted that it attracted only the best people. And in fact, what we really meant there, that only the best people could become classicists. And here I actually mean white people. And of course, we mean really upper middle class white people. And until about the 1980s, mostly male white upper class people. It is a well-known fact, known to anyone who has read Phillis Wheatley or W.E.B. Du Bois or Frederick Douglass, that classics was used as a gatekeeper to higher education against Black Americans after emancipation. It was stated unequivocally by numerous leaders in academia and politics well into the 20th century that the Black mind, like the woman's mind, was unable to understand and attain mastery of the classics. W.E.B. Du Bois's life work with classics was intended to prove this a lie, and he worked to promote classical education to his talented tenth so that through this education, because he knew classical education was the gateway to getting into universities, they could gain access to university, create a professional class to serve Black communities as doctors, lawyers, and other professionals, when it became clear after Reconstruction stalled that segregation and not integration was going to be the law of the land. And yet in this same period, a period known as Redemption, in which white Southerners reclaimed their legislatures and local governments from Black Americans who had made advances under Reconstruction, sought to take their segregationist ways nationwide. So we have a concurrent development of the field of classics as it becomes embedded in higher education, which becomes increasingly narrow and narrow and narrow and is used as a gatekeeper at the same time as we have the development of the science of man, under the, as it's called, which takes as its proposition that people who are white Northern European descent are premier, and then they create a structure and hierarchies around this. So we have concurrent development, and they use the classical texts and the ideas within them to create the scaffolding for the science of man that they're going to use, and then they use them back and forth to prove each other, essentially. Right? Classics is the best because it's produced by the best people, and it attracts the best people, and we know this because science tells us, science that's based on our ancient sources, tell us that this is how the world works. And what we then have, what's really interesting, is the science develops. I think this is a really interesting point. I've not gone through the legwork on it, but the science really reaches its height. It starts really starting around 1859 when Naughton Glidden's book is published, but we see it sort of reach its pinnacle, and what I'm going to show you in a minute, in the 1890s, which is after Reconstruction, and which is moving us into the period which they refer to as Redemption, which is when, particularly in the South, Southern white landowners, etc., move back in to take control of what they had lost under Reconstruction. And they're going to take this nationwide in the way that I'm going to show you in a minute visually. Right? So we're going to have a strong visual link that is going to be created in order to make this idea of whiteness and the classical and superior and the classical make headway. And they're going to use the science of eugenics in particular, but they're going to link it up to classically styled visual representations. All right? So I want to start with plantation architecture. So one of the things that we see and then you can sort of walk around your campuses and you get to see the glory of the white columns. The white columns were actually not particularly prominent for a long period of time, except in plantation houses. And what we actually see is if you look at the architecture and spacing of plantations, you see all of the classical elements are focused into the main house, and then as you get further away from the main house, you lose the classical elements. All right? And you could order these things through catalogs. A lot of these houses are in fact put together through catalogs. So you would order the pieces already produced and carved in other locations, and then they would be brought and assembled on site. This dissertation, Racializing the Ancient World, Ancestry and Identity in the Early United States, is quite good. I met Lyra. She's very good. She's working on publishing it at some point. So that architecture gets picked up by the Berman, who is the architect of the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. It was intended to open in 1892 in honor of the anniversary of Columbus's landing on the shores of the so-called New World. And the idea here is that they were going to create a place which they refer to as the White City, which they were going to technologically engineer on what had been a sort of wasteland strand in Chicago along the lake. And the core of it is this place called the White City, which you can see illustrations of and photos of, which is essentially a whole classically neoclassical city. And they didn't make it out of marble, they made it out of wood, and then they took white plaster and painted it up so that it would shine brilliantly white. They filled it with statues. I put this sort of allegory for agriculture down here, but one of my favorite statues is actually the statue of the quote-unquote real American, which is one of the sort of first places where we see this direct correlation between Midwestern farmers and real Americans. So this thing where you keep hearing every time you read the New York Times, where they're telling you that, oh, well, real Americans, and they mean the Midwest as opposed to urban. We have cities in the Midwest. I know it's hard to believe, but we do have them. And we have non-white people in the Midwest as well, but they're not quote-unquote real Americans. And so this is where the equation gets formed. Outside, so you have this white city, and then you have all these allegorical representations. Everything is done in pure white stucco. One architect, however, defied this, the guy who built the transportation building, and he used influences of Moorish architecture and painted his building up gaudily because he felt that this building essentially set back American architecture by about 50 years, that they didn't progress out because of this. Outside of the fairgrounds, oh, here's our real American. There he is, right here. Outside of the fairgrounds, the anthropologists got to build what they call the Midway Plaisance. And the Midway Plaisance was essentially, if you go to a carnival or fair today, it's like all the rides and all the vendors. This is where belly dancing was introduced to the United States. They had a place called the Streets of Cairo, which you can see down here. You had an Eskimo village that had a roller coaster in it that you could ride on. It essentially takes all the different people, and those Africans are being set up in little huts on display for people to see. Indigenous peoples are being set up and staged around teepees so that people can come and gaze at them and gawk at them. This is not the first fair. This was the second World's Fair in the United States, and then we'll have a series of them afterwards. The 1905 St. Louis Fair is probably one of the most important in the building of sort of what we think of as standard race hierarchies in America. This was the one that the big arch was built for, and this is the one where we have the representation of America's silent empire, so the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and other places, where people were put on display. And my favorite aspect of that fair, favorite as in, I can't believe anyone thought this was a good idea, my favorite aspect of that fair is when the indigenous peoples who they put on display at the fair, they weren't fierce enough for the visitors, and so they brought in Wild Bill Hickok's Cowboys and Indians show to put on fights for the audiences. This gives you an idea of the level of this. But if you think about it, I think it's something like 38 million people went to the Chicago Fair. So if you want to understand how this vision of whiteness and this vision of the classics being connected to whiteness and this vision of people who aren't white Americans as being outside of the white city, not welcome in the white city, and sort of exotification of peoples, this reached a lot of people. And it was intimately tied up to the ideas of technology and technological advancement and to product placement. It's sort of one of the originating moments of the grand marketing schemes. These fairs continued, and what happens is that this is from the race betterment booth that you see here is from the San Francisco Fair in 1935, the California Fair. And what we'll see is that instead of having entire structures that are classical, we will see a movement towards having simple statues and other things representing that classical. Now, at the Chicago's Fair, there was not a race betterment booth because the eugenics movement had not been really initiated in the US. That comes in 1910-ish with the founding of the Cold Spring Harbor Lab by Davenport. But we do have a craniometric booth at the Chicago World's Fair, and it was run by Franz Boas. It was one of his first assignments. And what they did is they had a picture of a Harvard man and a Radcliffe girl, and you were to measure yourself against them to see how good of, how healthy and how appropriate you were as a human being, apparently, measured against these two. And they would measure your skull and let you measure it up against the Harvard and the Radcliffe woman. So that was sort of the initial phase of it. It then gets picked up even more. And I put these two figures together because these two images actually are only 4 years apart. People forget that the Nazis were actually the foundation. They took as their foundation both for the Nuremberg laws and for their scientific activities. One, American eugenics programs. We have a lot of clear, direct connections between the eugenicists in the US and the Nazis, and they use Jim Crow as the basis for the Nuremberg laws. This is well-documented material, so I'm not making stuff up. I'm just not going to go through all of the material. But you can see sort of the use of these sculptures, the admiration for the sculptures, and I'm not going to go into this whole thing about polychromy and the painting of sculptures. It's not the whiteness of the marble that's actually admirable, it's the origin point of them and the fact that they are using, these are, none of these sculptures that you see are in fact classical sculptures. These are modern reproductions that actually take and turn into, they make them look like classical sculptures, but they have the idealized body types that they themselves want to promote. So you'll never see like the boxer being up here or something. The Discobolus is the exception that everybody seems to love, Nazis and eugenicists alike. So the forging of this link between classics and whiteness had consequences both within and without the discipline. Within the discipline, it led to the whitewashing of the ancient Greeks and Romans themselves. They became, as Bernard Knox once so proudly put it, the oldest dead white European males. And as part of this whitewashing, not only did our ancient Greeks and Romans, for whom the concept of whiteness had no meaning, become themselves avatars of modern white supremacism, the discipline itself dismissed as lesser than and irrelevant the interconnected cultures of the ancient Mediterranean and created the narrow field we know today, with its almost exclusive focus on Greek and Latin languages and a select canon of Golden Age texts. More important, I think, to the loss of the discipline, though, is sort of how this has been played out in the public arena. It's the situation, really, of classics as a white discipline. I can see, this room. And the positing of Greece and Rome at the heart of and the foundation of this thing we call Western civilization, that is, for better or for worse, a term used to mean in popular discourse, and I've trolled enough websites to know this is true, to mean white elite Christian civilization. And it's one that is strangely viewed increasingly as a genetic inheritance, not as one that is a cultural inheritance, but one that you must be the right kind of person to inherit. This is a tricky connection, the idea being that there is something in our DNA that supposedly makes those of us who are of European descent the true inheritors of Greek and to a lesser extent Roman civilization. This idea has made its way into mainstream genetics publications, which I'll go through in a second, and is leading in some ways to the re-emergence of scientific racism that we thought had been erased and discredited by the scientific horrors of World War II. So I want to start us here. Here, this one, I love this one just because. Have you guys seen the videos of white supremacists chugging milk? Right, there's this like fake idea that only people who come from certain Northern European locations can drink milk, which is totally not true. Like people from India drink lots of milk and they can digest it just fine. But what you guys don't know is the whole like getting milk in your lunch for free as a kid in school was actually part of the eugenics program that was funded by Kellogg, the guy who invented the cereal. And then, of course, all of you who ever had to learn square dancing can blame Ford, Henry Ford, because he decided that there was no true white American dance form. And so they invented square dancing and made us all learn it. I've never forgiven for that. So I want to start by sort of letting you know why we talk about Greeks. There seems to be something very particular about trying to locate ourselves with ancient Greek DNA that we don't have locating ourselves with Romans. And the reason why is because starting in the 19-teens, with an article published by a guy named Tenny Frank, it became the norm to agree that Rome fell because it was mixed race. They allowed all these foreigners in and Rome fell apart. And so we had to stop looking to Rome. We couldn't look to Rome, and we could never find a pure Roman. The idea, however, is that through ancient DNA studies, we can somehow magically find a pure Greek. We can't find a pure Roman. This website I'm putting up, this guy Roger Pearson, he is the founder of numerous white supremacist and eugenics geared journals, but he's also the founder of the Journal for Indo-European Studies. There's a strong link in the early days between Indo-European studies, as you might suspect, and Aryanism and white supremacy. So here's one of the websites. This one was published in 2018. The dude who wrote this was writes for Stormfront, etc. But they love to use, death by multiculturalism. That's how Rome fell. Augustus enacted birth laws in order to try to reverse this, but apparently he failed, as it were. And then one of my favorites is the American Renaissance Journal, which is this whole article. I don't suggest you look it up, but if you decide that you want to sort of self-flagellate, you can go look it up. And the whole thing is just quotations from ancient Greek and Roman texts that go into what they support the whiteness of the ancient Greeks and Romans. They particularly like Juvenal. Big surprise right there, right? Juvenal, great guy. So here we go. We'll go into our ancient DNA studies. So of course Tenny Frank and his theory of race mixture that killed Rome, it could not be tested back when he wrote his article. But everyone assumed, and everyone in many of these communities assumes, that Romans are a mongrel people, and so you can't find them as pure forms, so what's the point of studying them? So instead, they keep spending their time searching for a time and a place where they can find somehow a pure European, a pure African, or a pure Asian. And even David Reich, perhaps the most well-known geneticist working on ADNE, admits that there is, in fact, no pure DNA anyway. It's all admixture. But for some reason, particularly Greek scholars, Greek geneticists are looking to try to find something else. So background here, and here's my little 5-second synopsis of the Human Genome Project, which we can be corrected on later. So the Human Genome Project went from 1990 to 2003 and had the goal of mapping the entire human DNA sequence through what are called nucleotides, of which we apparently have over 3 billion. The project could not sequence any individual because all individuals have unique combinations of genes, but they were able to make a composite map, apparently, of all human DNA, with all humans basically having somewhere between 99.4 and 99.9, roughly, 99-ish thing. This changes, the number changes regularly. Of their genes in common, though we have variation with Neanderthals and Denisovians and whatnot. Scientists who are interested in trying to understand human physiological variation can focus in on trying to extract meaningful differences. But mostly scientists have decided that what they want to understand is what the differences are that could help us make distinction between someone whose ancestors are from Europe and those whose ancestors are from Africa, with a specific emphasis on hair texture and skin color. These are the chosen markers that they often look for in these ancient DNA studies. Greek ancient DNA studies are, in fact, the key to many of these approaches. They're looking to find Greek DNA. Now, in 2017, there was a series of ancient DNA studies on Greeks published. One of the perhaps most well-known is this one. It was led by Yosef Lazaridis, a geneticist at Harvard, and focused on the aDNA of 19 skeletons found in mainland Greece, Crete, and Anatolia. And then they compared them with the DNA of 30 living Greeks. The lead author of the second study that I'll look at in a second, and I'm going to say his name and I'm going to miss a syllable, but it's George Stamatoyiannopoulos, and I didn't miss a syllable. He also participated in the first study. The Lazaridis study was published in Nature, one of the top journals, and was written up in Science. This is the popularized version of the study. It has a real clickbait title here. This is not the official publication in Nature. This is the popularized version. The Greeks really do have near mythical origins, ancient DNA reveals. The authors themselves were a bit more circumspect. Here in the popularizing version, you see the opening paragraph. Ever since the days of Homer, Greeks have long idealized their Mycenaean ancestors in epic poems and classical tragedies that glorify the exploits, blah, blah, blah. It goes through this whole thing. This is one of the issues that I think a lot of my colleagues who do ancient DNA research are suffering from right now, is the way the popularization wheel turns. They don't always get to decide how it gets popularized, and the fastness and the quickness with which it happens is sometimes problematic for people. There's been a couple of really good articles and meetings that have been taking place between historians, archaeologists, and geneticists who are working on aDNA in order to sort of get us all on the same page and working together so that we're not working against each other in many ways, but that's still in its infant stages. So the study emphasized continuities between Mycenaeans, Minoans, and modern Greeks. The study was criticized by many archaeologists for its small sample size, its lack of randomization, and its use of a likelihood model for the reconstruction of parts where they couldn't actually get information from the samples. Importantly for us, they claim in the paper that they were expecting to find more variation in the genes than they did. Quote, the continuity between Mycenaeans and living people is, quote, particularly striking given that the Aegean has been a crossroads of civilizations for thousands of years, says co-author George Stelianopoulos, can't even say it, of the University of Washington, Seattle. They expected, they said, to find more gene variation, but one of the things that we know from the study is that they very selectively chose their samples, and then they set their likelihood model to a very specific set of gene markers. They should not have been surprised at what they found. They did not do a full sequencing of any of this. Now, I offered the study to my own students who were majoring in biology and taking genetics courses, who were able to point out numerous of the flaws in the data, including, importantly, that they had already predetermined where everyone was from when they did the testing. Also importantly, they didn't do any sort of collaborative testing of stable isotopes, either strontium or oxygen isotopes, to try to find out if these people were actually from the places where they were buried in. They just assumed that if they were buried there, that was where they were from. And then they marked it accordingly based on a very small number of samples. My friend and colleague Dimitri Nakasis, who is a Bronze Age archaeologist, wrote up on his own blog a response to the study where he questioned the methodology. Responses to his post and also to other posts of the article on the internet elicited something interesting, which gives us an idea of the politics, the political dimension of such a study within a US context, particularly how such a study can be used to support white supremacism. In each of the responses, they honed in on the fact that while the 11 bodies from Bronze Age Crete and the 4 bodies from Bronze Age Peloponnese shared almost 70% of their genetic markers that they examined, there was a range of from 4 to 16% of, quote, Northern European DNA in the 4 bodies from the Peloponnese, while it was non-existent in the 11 Cretan bodies. To these white supremacists, this was evidence of the truth of the so-called Dorian invasion, and evidence to them that the, quote, glory that was Greece and the Spartan military machine that they love so much was in fact an Aryan extraction. This is a favorite map of mine. It's from a 1939 Nazi textbook that tells us what the Germans thought of human population movements. And as you can see, the Germans are responsible for everything. Our Nordic friends are responsible for all cultures. Greece, Rome, Asia, Egypt, all from them. Now, this study seems to have been intended to show that modern Greeks were indeed descendants from ancient Greeks and that Crete was also Greek, because this is a sort of a bone of contention. There are nationalistic reasons for wanting such data, but this study, the 2017 study on this set, they were at least coy about their motivations. The other study, however, that was led by Stamatoianopoulos is actually a bit different and is far more explicit and nationalist in its goals. Its stated goal, explicitly stated goal, was to prove that statements by the 19th century German historian Jacob Philipp Fallmeier that he was wrong when he said that modern Greeks were not descended from ancient Greeks, but that they had been replaced by Armenians, Turks, and others in the Byzantine and Ottoman periods. I believe that his direct quotation is something like, "Not the slightest bit of undiluted Hellenic blood flows in the veins of the Christian population of modern Greece." The Greeks, if you get in a taxi in Greece today and you bring up Fallmeyer's name, you'll get an earful still to this day. They just do not like this guy. And so an entire study was in fact set up in order to disprove his theory. The idea here was something that's very commonly expressed by white supremacists. Fallmeyer's sentiment was accompanied by a conviction that Northern Europeans were in fact the true inheritors of Greece. Something shared by later people like Madison Grant, the author of Passing of the Great Race, who posited the Nordic origins for all ancient civilizations, which ended, he claimed, because of miscegenation with non-Nordics. So here is the introduction of the study that is meant to prove that modern Greeks are ancient Greeks. A lot of it is about Slavs and not wanting to be Slavic. The citations for this introduction, here's my favorite part. So the citations for this introduction that they give, none of them, not a single one of them, comes from any scholarship dated after 1970. And he actually argues for, I want to look at this one here. Peloponnese was peopled by a series of migrations that spanned almost 9 millennia. He goes on and says, the next migration took place at the beginning of the first millennium BC with the invasion of the Peloponnese by the Dorian Greeks, referred to as the Dorian invasion. He gives no scholarly citations, no archaeological evidence, nothing for this invasion. His source for this is Herodotus. These scientists have not read a single discussion by historians or archaeologists of this data. In fact, historians are dismissed within his introduction as being ideological, while he frames his own study as being objective. But if you look at the language, this is not objective language. As with many a historical myth about the origins of the various Greek cultures, this one does have its source in Herodotus, but archaeology simply cannot hold this up. And since the 1970s, no historian who is not a white supremacist has argued that it was in fact a true study. But now we have this idea being published as if it is a fact in a top science journal by teams of geneticists who are dismissive of social sciences and humanities, who present their work as silver bullets to solve all of the great mysteries of antiquity and who neither do their research nor have large enough sample sizes to make this grand pronouncement. Now, the question is, why does this matter to us classicists? And I want to say that there's a lot of really good genetics work on ancient DNA being done. It's just not this dude here. It matters because, as archaeologist Susan Hackenbeck has written in a new article in World Archaeology on archaeogenetics, many of these studies, far from reading the data neutrally, instead use the data to affirm 19th century racist theories of northern migrations as true events of population replacement. In other words, aDNA is being used to write histories that return to models anew that erroneously suggest that all Mediterranean civilizations are products of Northern European aggression. Even when the archaeology does not support this, these studies are being used to provide quote-unquote objective evidence that can quote-unquote speak for itself to support these racist narratives. And this is exactly what is happening with these studies, which are being popularized so quickly and without context or nuance, and which are being published by individuals with agendas. As Hackenbach's research shows, the far-right nationalist groups, including neo-Nazi groups, she did a whole big study of Stormfront, of their website and how they're using these studies to promote those ideas. They're promoting hate on these websites. Golden Dawn in Greece, which currently, thank God, as of July 7th, lost its representation in the Greek parliament, is using these studies to promote their own nationalist ends. Perhaps closer to home, however, these studies are being used by scientists like David Reich to argue for mass migrations and replacements of populations through war and violence, something that you can't actually show through DNA. This fuels contemporary fears by white supremacist groups that such replacements are real, and they refer frequently in their literature to something that they call race suicide or race genocide. So race suicide is miscegenation, that someone intentionally marries someone outside of their race, so that this is an act of destroying their race. My husband is Jewish, so I am a committer of race suicide. Race genocide is something slightly different. Now, some of us work on college campuses where white nationalist groups have hung posters either to recruit new members or to impact campus climate and intimidate those who speak out against it. Here's a sort of a free-for-all of various posters that have popped up. If you recall anything about the reports from the Charlottesville rally 2 years ago, the chant being uttered was, "Jews will not replace us." And in this poster from the Daily Stormer, which was on my own campus this summer, the book, The Great Replacement, is in the hands of the New Zealand killer. The book The Great Replacement refers to a 1978 novel of the same name by a French nationalist, and is a dystopian fiction about mass immigration from North Africa into France that literally, according to the book, overnight replaces the entire population. This is what they mean when they talk about race genocide and the Great Replacement. Now imagine this book being promoted during the current refugee crisis in Europe as a work not of fiction, but as a prophecy for the disappearance of a white Europe, because this is in fact what is happening on the internet and other places. Now, ADNA studies of the Bronze Age that are searching for the origins of the Greeks or other ancient groups in the Mediterranean can't in this context be innocent or objective. And to not take that context into consideration is in many ways irresponsible. They are part of an ongoing political climate that is used to promote white supremacism and colonialism, and to increase and promote fear of diversity and fear of decline. And they are part of a long tradition of centering the classics and the Greeks as the foundation of a white, Western, and Christian civilization. They try to make that cultural heritage, which is in fact open to anyone who chooses to study it, and turn it into a genetic inheritance that only certain people can be permitted to in fact access. And the ideas embedded in this search for a genetic link to the Greeks is part of the history of eugenics, and the struggle to connect a pure Europeanness to a pure whiteness. And our ancient sources like Plato's Republic, like the Athenian myth of autochthony and exceptionalism, like the laws established in classical Athens to maintain a pure citizen body, do give fodder to people who want to argue for the validity, universality, and authority of these ideas. This is one of the reasons why it is incumbent upon us as classicists and ancient historians to teach a more accurate ancient Mediterranean past. It is also why it is important that we work together with our colleagues in the sciences to help excavate the history of scientific racism and recognize the place not just of classics, but also of anthropology and of biology within it. Because of the science of the 19th century has, despite changes in language and recognition of the horrors of the Holocaust and other attempts to move outside of thinking in terms of race, it has still maintained its place in modern science. These ideas may not have been racist in their original context, except perhaps Athenian autochthony and exceptionalism as the rationale for the metric system, but they were and continue to be deployed in support of racist structures today. Thank you. The talk is put up here just to have at the end. This is from Patriot Front's website. So you can see a little bit about how this stuff gets put into play. And one of the things you'll also see is a manipulation of the language of e pluribus unum and the idea of conquest as a form of replacement that is acceptable because it is the superior race replacing the inferior race. And this is blood and soil ideology right out of the Nazi playbook and in fact before. But this is the context within which these genetic studies are being used as evidence for mass migration and replacement theory. So, there we go.
Well, thank you for this really enthralling, fascinating.
I'm really sorry for running through everything so quickly. It's too much.
Do you have time for questions and
I
discussion?
have plenty of time.
Okay, great.
I mean,
I'm sure there's many things people have to say.
I'm sitting in a hotel here in Vermont tonight. I'm not catching a flight anywhere. So I'm happy to be corrected or answer questions. There's a lot more material that I just couldn't fit into this talk. So, yeah.
Excuse me. This is UVM was a university that had white supremacist posters putting up, and we had a big student backlash after the events. And sometimes I felt like that backlash wasn't always productive. And so, given your experience dealing with these groups, do you have any recommendations or ideas on how to confront it and make positive change?
So I would say, first thing I would say is that they don't actually want a conversation. And so attempting to set up a dialogue with a group, people from representing Patriot Front or Identity Europa, well, they've changed their name now. Identity Europa has changed their name. It's ironic. They changed their name to something that reduces to AIM, A-I-M, which was, of course, the original group supporting indigenous people in the country, so they've now appropriated that acronym. Or, I'm never going to have a conversation with anybody who represents Stormfront or the Daily Stormer or that group. And the founder of that group is like 30 miles away from our campus, right? So it's kind of scary. I get things in the mail from them to let them, so that they can tell me that they know where I live. And so they're not looking for a productive conversation. They are looking to intimidate, and they are looking to silence, and they are looking to make sure that on college campuses, they are trying to tell us that they don't want us to have conversations like this. If you look at this, so this is Daily Stormer. This is their book club, okay, poster. And look at what they're tagging onto, increase free speech. One of the things that these groups are doing, and we want to think about it in this way. First off, white supremacism is pervasive. It's not like, this is not white supremacy. This is like extreme version of it. White supremacy is basically sort of the everyday water that we swim in. The sort of structures that we exist in that allow for people who are white to not be shot by police in their own homes, right? That's sort of the everyday environment. This is extreme forms. What they're doing is they're picking up the rhetoric that is being used by people who are sort of more center-right about free speech on college campuses, and then they're using this to put up intimidating posters. Because this says, increase free speech and increase the peace with the New Zealand killer with his gun, right? How am I supposed to feel that that's about a dialogue? It's not. So a better way to approach it is not to attempt to even have a dialogue with people who carry these views, or student groups that might bring in speakers who have fringe people who agree with these groups. A better conversation is actually to talk to try to make adjustments in the campus itself amongst people who actually disavow this. Because there's a whole range of people who will disavow this, who actually participate in everyday white supremacy without even thinking about it. And that's actually where you can make more productive changes than trying to change somebody who thinks that this is an appropriate way to start a conversation. Because that's not what they're trying to do. So working with other student groups that maybe they're not, they don't realize that they, or maybe they do realize, but at least they're not like going to threaten you with a gun, that's the conversation to have. And those are, if somebody's going to invite Mila Yiannopoulos or like Jordan Peterson or something to campus, they don't really want to talk. And I know that sounds really negative, but it's the truth. So I wouldn't say it's siloing either. There's a broad range of people on the quote-unquote left. And I think it's better to sort of hit there and get people who suffer from things like white fragility and other things who want to actually be supportive, but fail at it. Yeah.
So kind of to talk about the scientific side of like analyzing genetics and stuff, at least from what I've been taught, and like from science, it's usually it's kind of drilled into students that you want to try and be as unbiased and not really think about outside circumstances at all when you're like analyzing genetics.
Yeah, our good friend Stan Yiannopoulos failed there.
Yeah. So, so if you were to go looking into something that is charged, like ancient Greek DNA and like where potentially like ancestors
Indigenous
come
DNA.
from. Yes.
Anything on indigenous DNA is going to be
It's like
museum a few years ago to make sure we didn't have anything that was covered by NAGPRA, which we would have to return. Luckily, we don't have any Native American things at all. Not even, we have some baskets, but we bought those. So I don't feel so bad about it. But, so I think part of it is that really working with the groups who are impacted, particularly when dealing with things like indigenous DNA or dealing with things like the Pacific Islands and other places, with paying attention to the fact that there are other cultures. We treat the scientific method that we employ as a universal, and it's not. We can't assume that anything that comes out of the Enlightenment is a universal. We have to assume that there are other methodologies, that there are other